Hi, and welcome back to Crochet Every Day with Judy. Today we are reading from Robin Hood, and we're starting with chapter 21, Little John's Adventures as a Beggar. Now as time went on, and the name and the fame of Robin Hood and his merry men went forth in the land, abbots and squires, knights and friars, all began to grow shy of the roads which led through Sherwood Forest. Poor men came by in numbers, for they knew that Robin would help them on their way, but all those who grew rich by oppression and fraud began to learn that it was safer for them to keep out of Robin's reach. One night Robin Hood and Little John were sitting by the evening fire eating their supper of venison, when Little John said, "Master, it is many a day since we had a good haul. There seems never a rich abbot or Norman knight with good store of gold in his saddlebag that passes through the forest nowadays." "Let us be content," said Robin. "We have good food, good clothes, and good weapons." Excuse me. "What does man want more?" "I should like a little money as well," grumbled Little John. "Why, I could make more by begging than by ranging the greenwood, with never a fat old churl passing by with a purse of gold." "Thou a beggar!" laughed Robin Hood. "What advantage wouldst thou gain in that trade? Soon should we see thee marching back to the forest with pockets as empty as thou didst start with." "Nay, master," replied Little John, "a beggar may carry a dirty bag, but by my faith there is often something good in it." "Good meal, perhaps," said Robin slyly, and both laughed as they thought of the cunning beggar who had tricked them so finely some time before. Then the two began an argument about beggars and their winnings, until Little John declared roundly that he would take up the beggar's trade for a short time and convince his master that beggars were better off and gained more money than people who only considered their rags and tatters would think. So the next day Little John set off on a begging expedition. He put on a suit of tattered old clothes and a big hat with a broken brim, made a hump for his back by stuffing an old cloak up under his jacket, and hung a number of bags about him, for, he said, "A bag for my bread, another for my cheese, and one for a penny in case I get any, so that I may lose nothing." Away he went at a sturdy pace until he was clear of the forest and far from his usual haunts. Then he dropped into the beggar's saunter, twisted his body until he seemed as crooked as a pig's tail, leaned heavily on his staff, and began to whine to the passers-by for charity. He had received little or nothing, and was beginning to think that his master was right about begging, when he saw a band of 4 beggars on the road before him. He hastened at once to join them. "Good morning," said Little John. "Good morning, good brothers. I had good fortune to meet you. Which way are you going? Pray tell me, for I should be glad of your company." The beggars did not receive him in a very friendly fashion, for they were satisfied with their own company and did not want a comrade. But Little John hobbled along beside them and talked of the bad times and how closely people kept their purses shut, and all the usual chatter of a true beggar, and they could not cast him off. One of the beggars was a lame man. He had one leg tied up and went on crutches. The second was blind, the third was dumb, the fourth had only one arm, and he led the blind man, who had also a stick with which to feel his way. Soon after Little John joined this company, they saw a village in the distance and heard the slow tolling of bells. "Why ring all those bells?" asked Little John. "In truth, they are pealing slowly and heavily. I love to hear a bell go more trippingly." "It is a funeral," said the lame man. "Come on, brothers, there will be bread and cheese for us at any rate, and perhaps a penny apiece for our pockets." The lame man began to ply his crutches briskly, and the band of beggars hurried forward to join the crowd of mendicants which had gathered about the door of the village church. It was a wealthy franklin of the neighborhood who had died, and according to custom, a large quantity of food and money was being distributed among the poor and needy. The 4 beggars and Little John took up their places in the ranks of those waiting for charity, and before long each man received a huge hunch of bread and cheese and a silver penny. As soon as the dole had been given, the crowd of beggars broke up and set off in every direction. Little John still followed the 4 whom he had met. "Only 1 silver penny to each man," grumbled the blind fellow. "'Twas scarce worth breaking our journey to stay for that, brethren." "A penny is a penny," said the lame man. "So it is," cried the one-armed comrade, while the dumb man, of course, said nothing but munched heartily at the bread and cheese. "And we have lost time," growled the blind man. "Perhaps the wedding guests will be gone before we reach the manor house, and for the sake of this trumpery gift, we shall have lost a good chance of enriching ourselves." "Never fear," cried the lame man, stumping ahead at a round pace. "We shall get there betwixt day and dark, when the guests have drunk their fill." "The very time for us," grunted the one-armed man, who did not say much. "Oh ho," thought Little John, "these fellows are on their way to a wedding, where they look for richer gifts than at a funeral. I'll go, too. Perhaps there I can begin to fill my pouch and find a few coins to keep company with my silver penny." So the 4 beggars posted ahead by hill and dale, and Little John hobbled after them. They cast him many an ill look, for it was plain they wished to be alone, and the one-armed man proposed once that they should fall on him with their staves and drive him away. "We have no time to waste," said the blind man, who was the captain of the band. "Let him even follow to the wedding. There will be ale and wine flowing like water, and he will drink and forget all about us." It was late in the afternoon when the beggars drew near the scene of the merrymaking, and the dusk was beginning to settle down. But when they heard in the distance the joyous pealing of bells and shouts of the festive throng, they hurried on faster still, and at length gained an open space in front of a large house. Here a vast bonfire was burning, its flames leaping higher as it devoured faggots, tarred barrels, huge dried limbs of ash and oak and beech, and lighted the scene like noonday. Around this glorious blaze, a merry company of maids and men danced gaily, while at another fire, a whole ox was roasting. And barrels of ale and casks of wine were abroach on every side. Little John waited to see what his brethren would do, and was surprised that they did not at once seat the cooks and carvers, who were giving abundance of food to all who might ask for it. But the 4 beggars began to creep through the crowd where it was thickest, and Little John followed and watched. Soon he saw that they were thieves as well as beggars, for their hands went to the pouches and pockets of the most careless among the revelers, and drew out purses and slipped the latter into their wallets. Little John watched them and saw purse after purse filched, and noted that the gains were passed over either to the blind man or the one-armed man, who were the treasurers of the band. "By my faith," said Little John to himself, "and these fellows go to many weddings. Their bags are well lined, I warrant you." When the beggars had stolen all that lay to their hands, they slipped through the crowd and left the place before the hue and cry was raised. "There will be a pretty uproar here when those revelers find their purses gone," quoth Little John. But he did not stay to take part in that scene, for he did not wish to lose sight of the 4 beggars. It was no easy matter to follow them, for the night was dark, but Little John was not a forester for nothing, and he tracked them as he had often tracked a deer by the sounds they made when passing through bushes. For 2 hours or more the band of thieving beggars pushed on, and just after the moon rose, they paused at the door of a wretched little house in a clearing in a wood. Little John could now see them easily. Excuse me. And he watched them enter the hovel, then went forward, pushed open the door, and marched in. "What, brothers," he said, "is this your lodging for the night?" The beggars turned in surprise and anger and bade him begone. They felt sure he had been shaken off at the wedding, and here he was again, this big, humpbacked, twisted fellow. "Away with you," cried the lame man. "We want not thy company. How hast thou followed us here?" "Why should I not march with you?" urged Little John. "Am I not a beggar bold, just as ye are?" "Begone," cried the lame man, and flourished his staff. "Thou art too crooked for our company." His comrades laughed at this jest, and a second beggar broke in. "We have brethren in London, Coventry, Berwick, and Dover, but in all the world we have no brother as crooked as thou." "Away, thou crooked rogue," cried the lame man, again swinging up his staff, "or I will give thee one on the crown." "Now have at you all," roared Little John, "and you be so full of your blows, I will even have a try at you. Fight on, all 4. Here am I to withstand you. Cheats ye are, one and all, and I will show it instantly." With that, Little John stepped forward and caught the dumb man by the ear and nipped him shrewdly with finger and thumb, so that the dumb man yelled with the pain, and finding his tongue by a miracle, began to call Little John very bad names. Next, Little John fetched a swinging blow at the blind man's head. But what did the blind man do but spring nimbly to one side and dodge the blow, his eyes wide open and looking out for the next sweep of the giant's weapon. The lame man dropped his crutches, set feet to the ground, made one jump for the door, and ran as nimbly as a hare, and the dumb man followed him. The one-armed man slipped a second arm from beneath his ragged cloak and caught up a staff which the lame man had dropped. But 2 men had fled, and 2 men were left, for Little John stood between them and the door. The 2 beggars tried to fight their way out of the place, but every effort was in vain. The huge, ragged man parried every blow from their staves and gave them such tremendous knocks in return that they reeled against the side of the house, and the bags of money under their cloaks clashed against the wall. "Strip, you knaves, strip," roared Little John, chuckling to think that he had penned up the money-bearers of the band. "Strip, or I will break every bone in your skins." The beggars were very unwilling to part with their hoard, but the giant's stick was too dreadful for them to face any longer. "Off with cloaks and jackets!" cried Little John. Promptly he was obeyed. "Down with bags and wallets!" he said, and with very sour faces the beggars loosened the clinking bags and dropped them to the ground. "Now away with you!" cried Little John, "or down comes my staff," and in fear of his terrible stick they fled from the place. Little John now began to search the beggars' clothes and soon found some very heavy bags. "Aha!" said the big fellow to himself, "many a fat purse hath been emptied into these bags, I warrant me, and now will I see what is stitched into this cloak, for it feels a monstrous weight." Then he got out of the beggar's cloak 300 pounds in gold. "Good fortune had I then," said Little John, "such a good sight to behold. But what found he in the beggar's bag but 300 pounds and 3? If I drink water while this doth last, then an ill death may I die. And my begging trade I will now give o'er, my fortune hath been so good. Therefore I'll not stay, but I will away to the forest of merry Sherwood." Away went Little John at once and put his best foot foremost. He marched all night, and the break of day found him on the borders of Sherwood Forest. He pressed in among the trees, and now and again he sounded his horn as he went. Tan-ta-ta-ra-ra, tan-ta-ra-ra-ra. The merry notes rang and re-echoed along the woodland glades and announced his approach in the gayest and liveliest fashion. Presently he saw a group of yeomen who had heard his horn and recognized his call and had come hurrying to meet him. At their head was his master. "What news, Little John? Come tell me how thou hast fared with thy beggar's task," cried Robin Hood. Little John laughed and flung down his spoils at his master's feet. Clink, clank went the heavy bags of money. "Why, what have we here?" cried Robin Hood in wonder. "What news is this, Little John?" "Nothing but good news," replied Little John. "Indeed, I have fared well in my begging, for 603 pounds in red gold and gleaming white silver I have here for thee, my master." He opened the bags and poured out the money before the eyes of his amazed friends. "By Our Lady, Little John," cried Robin Hood, "but thou hast indeed proved a notable beggar. Here is a noble heap of money. How camest thou by it?" Little John related his adventures, and his comrades laughed to hear how the tricksters had been tricked. Then they carried the money to the treasure house, and that night there was a mighty feast in honor of Little John, the Prince of Beggars. Chapter 22. How Robin Hood was seized by the sheriff. A more lovely May morning never dawned than the Sunday morning after Little John returned from his begging expedition. The sun was hot and bright, and the young leaves shook in a sweet, gentle breeze, which was loaded with fragrance as it swept softly through the forest. The grass was dotted with wild flowers, and the dappled deer had left the sunny heights to lie in the shade of the greenwood trees. It was the most delightful day of that delightful time of early summer, and it was Whitsunday. "By my faith," said Little John to his master, "but this is a merry morning, and I feel in tune with it. A more merry man than I doth not live today in Christendom." But Robin Hood made no answer, and Little John saw that there was a cloud on his master's brow. "Pluck up thy heart, my dear master," said Little John, "and bethink thee it is a full fair time in a morning of May." "It troubles me much," said Robin Hood, "that on so solemn a day as this I can go neither to mass nor matins. It is long now since I stood in a church to worship." "There is no church nearer than Nottingham," said Much the miller's son, who stood near at hand. "And to Nottingham I will go," cried Robin, taking one of his sudden determinations. "Yes, I will attend St. Mary's Church in Nottingham this very day." Much and Little John tried to dissuade him, but all to no purpose. "None will suspect me of entering the town on a Sunday," replied Robin, "and I will wear a gray suit with a large hood and pull the hood over my face. I shall go and come as safely as walking to and fro in the glade." "Well, master," said Much, "then take a dozen stout fellows with you, each man with his weapons, so that help may be at hand if you should need it." "Nay," said Robin, 12 men would draw attention at the gate, where only 1 or 2 would pass unnoticed. Of all merry men, I will have none save Little John to bear my bow." So Robin Hood and Little John set off together through the forest toward Nottingham. Now it happened that as they went, they fell into a wrangle, and the dispute grew so high that Robin Hood quite lost his temper and struck Little John a blow with his hand. The giant was very angry at this insult and whipped out his sword. "Had any man but my master struck me," cried Little John, "his blood should have stained this bright sword. Now thou mayest get a man where thou wilt, Robin Hood, but thou gettest me no more." So they parted in wrath, and while Robin went on towards Nottingham, Little John turned back to the forest. Robin's anger soon died away, and he felt very sorry to think he had vexed his faithful follower. "I will pray at St. Mary's altar that Little John may be reconciled to me again," he said as he came in sight of the town and saw the church tower rising high above the walls. He passed through the gate easily, for the warders did not look twice at a single man in the gray clothes of a peasant, and Robin went straight to the church. The service was about to begin, and he knelt down before the altar and prayed that he might leave the town as safely as he came in. Now, about the middle of the service, a tall monk in a black habit entered the church and began to move softly up the aisle towards his place in the chancel. Suddenly, he stopped in the shadow of a pillar and stared with all his eyes. Just beyond the pillar, a man was kneeling devoutly on the rushes spread over the floor of the church. The man was clad in gray, and his hood had fallen back, for he raised his head in eager attention to the priest who was reading the service. The black monk looked again and again. Surely he knew that face. Yes, he was now quite sure, and the monk's eyes were filled with the light of anger and hatred as he turned and glided swiftly down the church again. Robin Hood knelt on, quite unconscious that he stood in the greatest danger, quite unconscious that the High Cellarer of St. Mary's had recognized him, and was now moving hotfoot to take measures for his capture. The black monk came to the door of the church, and now he fairly ran, such was his haste, to warn the authorities. First, he hurried to the gates and spoke to the warders. "Close the gates. Lock and bar them," he cried. "There is a great felon in the town. Your heads will answer for it if you let any man pass to or fro until the sheriff gives you leave." The warders made haste to shut the gates and place themselves on guard. "Now I have Robin Hood, yea, Robin Hood himself," cried the black monk exultantly as he sped to the sheriff's house. "He cannot leave the town, and he lies in our hands like a bird in a trap." Into the sheriff's hall the black monk burst without ceremony, and found the great man sitting idly in his chair. "Up, Sir Sheriff," cried the High Cellarer. "Up and order out your men. I bring great news. The king's felon is in this town and may be seized. I have spied the false felon as he stood at mass. 'Twere an ill day for you, Sir Sheriff, should he escape the king's justice." "What's this pother about?" demanded the sheriff in surly tones, for he had been roused from a nap, and the black monk in his haste had not mentioned the felon's name. "Some petty rogue, I warrant, who hath but made free with the abbey hen roost." "Petty rogue," roared the black monk. "Did I not name him? Petty rogue indeed, Sir Sheriff. Why, 'tis Robin Hood." Now, you may be sure, the sheriff was roused. He leaped from his chair and faced the black monk, and glittering eyes looked into glittering eyes. "Robin Hood," gasped the sheriff, "and in Nottingham again? Never!" "'Tis simple truth," cried the High Cellarer. "I have seen him even now at mass in St. Mary's. What, think you I could be mistaken in the sturdy rogue who robbed me of hundreds of pounds in the greenwood and brought me into dreadful trouble with the abbot? Nay, Sir Sheriff, but his face is never out of my mind, never. I would know him among 1,000. The sheriff could still scarce grasp the idea that Robin Hood was inside the walls, but he raised a silver whistle which hung at his girdle and blew a call. A servant came in at once. "Bid Dickon and Hal attend me with 30 of the foresters," ordered the sheriff, and took down his harness from a stand in the hall and began to array himself. By the time he had donned steel cap and a great leathern coat covered with steel links, and girded his sword about him, his men were mustered, and they marched at once to the church. The entry of this armed force caused a great commotion in the place, but the sheriff cried out, "Fear not, good people. I wish ye no harm. I have but come to seize a great rogue who hath crept in among you." "There he is," shouted the black monk, "yonder fellow in gray kneeling by the great pillar. He is Robin Hood." No one was more surprised than Robin himself to hear his name ringing through the church. He had no idea that he had been spied upon, and his hood was now drawn so closely down that his face was quite hidden. But what an uproar arose in the church when the people heard that the thrice-famous outlaw was in their midst. Some crowded to look upon him, some tried to push their way out of the place, and the sheriff's men blocked Robin's way to the door. The outlaw saw that his only chance was to make one fierce dash upon his enemies in the confusion and hope to cut his way out. He breathed but one wish. "Would that my faithful Little John stood at my side. Alas, but I miss him this day." Then he drew out his broadsword and rushed like a charging lion upon the ranks of the sheriff's men. Up rose a score of swords in the hands of the foresters, and many a blow was launched at the daring outlaw. But more haste, less speed, and the foresters only jostled each other, and clashed sword against sword, and missed their aim, while Robin's bright blade flashed in the air and struck down man after man. A tremendous fight did Robin Hood make for freedom that day. Thrice he cut his way through his foes, only to find new enemies in his path. To and fro leaped the outlaw, dodging blows and dealing strokes which felled forester after forester. "Slay him not," shrieked the sheriff. "Strike him down, but seize him alive. 'Tis the order of the king." Robin heard the voice and knew it was the sheriff who spoke. He turned and made a swift rush at his ancient enemy, swinging his blade on high. The sheriff shrank before that fierce assault and raised his shield to ward off the terrific blow which Robin aimed at him. Down fell the heavy blade and clanged on the shield and drove it from the sheriff's hand. Scarce checked in its fall, the sword clashed on the sheriff's steel cap and hurled him to the pavement. Well was it for the sheriff that day that he had put on a helmet of proof, a splendid piece of work of a great armorer, for naught else saved him. Had it been common steel, Robin's sword would have gone through it as if it had been a cap of paper. As it was, the helmet stood the blow, and the sword broke in two in Robin's hand. "I'll befall the smith that made thee," cried Robin, flinging down the broken sword, "for now I am weaponless in the midst of my enemies." And with that he leapt upon the nearest man and tried to wrench away the stout quarterstaff which the fellow had in his hand. But at the very moment he was tripped up from behind and stumbled and fell to the ground. At once a dozen men flung themselves upon him, and he was pinned down by the sheer weight of numbers, nor did his enemies loose their frenzied grip upon him until he was fast in bonds. By that time the sheriff had got to his feet again, rather dizzy from that thunderbolt stroke, but very glad to find his head safe inside his good steel cap, and almost beside himself with delight to think that he had Robin Hood in his hands at last. "Away with him," cried the sheriff. "Clap him into the deepest, strongest dungeon in the castle keep, and let a double watch mount guard over him night and day." This was done, and Robin Hood was shut up in a dungeon where only at high noon a little light came through a thick grating. The walls were 7 feet thick, and the door was fastened by 3 locks. "Let him break out of that if he can," cried the sheriff. "I have put the strong thief in a stronger place, and there must he stay." "Why trouble to shut him up in so strong a place?" said the black monk who burned to see Robin on the gallows. "Why not hang him up out of hand? I have heard you often threaten that you would do so if you could but seize him." "And so I would if the matter stood with me alone," snarled the sheriff. "I would have bidden my men to slay him on the spot had I dared." "And why dared you not?" demanded the high cellarer. "Who is there to gainsay the authority of the sheriff?" "One who is above us all," replied the sheriff in a low voice, "the king. He hath sent orders to me that should Robin Hood be seized, the rogue must await his pleasure. The king hath heard so much of this strong thief that he wishes to see him." The black monk said nothing for some time, but his brow was furrowed in thought. Then he spoke up. "Sir Sheriff, it was I who discovered the knave and delivered him into your hands." "Aye," said the sheriff. "Then I claim the right to bear the tidings of the capture to the king." "Aye," chuckled the sheriff, "and get some rich preferment from his majesty?" "If there be a reward, it is fitting it should come to me," cried the high cellarer. "I do not deny it," replied the sheriff, "and I wish with all my heart that you may get a fat abbey at the least to rule over. You have done me a great service, and I will make handsome mention of you in the letter which I shall write this afternoon to the king." "And I will start with it at break of day tomorrow," cried the black monk, who went at once to prepare for his journey. All that Sunday there was great commotion in Nottingham town. People ran to and fro talking of the capture of Robin Hood, and everyone that had been in St. Mary's Church that morning had a crowd round him, eagerly listening to his account of the great struggle the famous outlaw had made. Yet not a whisper of all this passed the walls to the country beyond, for the sheriff had doubled the guard at every gate and absolutely forbidden that any should go in or out until he learned the king's pleasure with regard to Robin Hood. "If no man goes out," said the sheriff, "then Robin Hood must stay with the rest of us. If no man comes in, then his rascals cannot sneak in from the forest to attempt a rescue." So Nottingham town lay like a beleaguered city, and its gates were barred and bolted night and day. But for all that, Robin's men soon learned the evil tidings through Lob the cobbler. Lob was one of the first to hear of Robin's capture, and as soon as darkness fell on the city, he went to the roof of his house, which was built against the inner side of the wall. With him were 2 men who were staunch friends of the outlaw, and these let Lob down over the wall by a rope. As soon as the cobbler's feet touched the ground, he unfastened the rope and it was drawn back. Then Lob hurried away to the forest as fast as he could go. Lob found a very uneasy band of outlaws gathered around the great fire in the glade where their camp was pitched. Every man was afraid that his leader had met with some mishap, since Robin had not returned, and most unhappy of all was Little John. The good-tempered giant had quite forgiven Robin's hasty blow, and now blamed himself that he had not stayed by his master's side. It would be impossible to picture the wrath and grief of the outlaws when they found that their worst fears were all too true, and that their beloved captain lay fast and hold in Nottingham town. But Little John stoutly refused to believe that the worst would happen. "He went to Nottingham to pray to Our Lady," said Little John, "and Our Lady will help him. Many a time, brothers, hath our noble master been hard bestead, yet hath given his enemies the go-by, and I'll warrant ye it will happen again. Let us pluck up our hearts and quit this morning, and let us go and break Let us go and watch the town and devise some plan for breaking in and freeing our leader." Before dawn, Little John was lying in wait in a thicket before the southern gate of Nottingham. With him was Much. Both had laid aside their forest green and wore plain leathern doublets and had the guise of graziers and dealers who went from fair to fair buying and selling cattle. In this dress they would attract no notice and could move freely about the country and through the neighboring villages. It was another lovely May morning, and when the sun came up in all his glory, their hearts ached to think that Robin Hood lay in a foul, dark dungeon, where no sound of the song of birds or the soft whisper of the rustling leaves could reach him. Then all their attention was drawn to the gates, for they saw a postern door opened and a small train come forth. The train was formed of a black monk riding a strong horse and a little page mounted on a white palfrey. The postern door was closed behind them, and monk and page rode toward the thicket where Little John and Much lay in hiding. "I know yonder black monk," whispered Little John to his comrade. "'Tis the high cellarer. Dost remember him, Much? We cleared his saddlebags of a round heap of gold." Much nodded, and then obeyed Little John's uplifted finger, which beckoned him to leave the thicket. The outlaws now took a sweep through the trees and came out on the road the black monk was following, and walked toward the town. At a bend they came upon monk and page riding at a foot pace and keeping a sharp lookout for any sign of danger. The monk cast a glance at the newcomers, but seeing two plain-looking fellows in dirty doublets trudging along staff in hand, he made no attempt to avoid them, and presently the two parties met. "Give you good day," said Little John, and bowed before the black monk. "Do you come from Nottingham?" "We do," said the monk. "Tell us the tidings, I pray you," went on Little John. "There is a story beginning to spread in the country that a desperate outlaw called Robin Hood was taken yesterday." See now how these tidings take wing in a manner none may understand," cried the black monk. "How the rumor came to thee I cannot say, but it is true, good yeoman. The strong rogue was seized yesterday in St. Mary's Church in Nottingham." We're going to stop there and start tomorrow on the second half of this chapter. Thank you for listening. Bye-bye.